Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to do a super quick tutorial on how to get a SQL instance set up on your local machine so that you can use it as a test lab. We're going to be covering two installation methods today. The first one we're going to cover is installing the SQL database directly to your operating system, so either a virtual machine or your host OS. And to do that, the example machine we're going to use today is Debian. If you have Ubuntu, that's totally fine, or any other distribution that uses apt package manager. Also, these steps will translate mostly to Yum or other package managers as well. You just might need to look up the specific package name. The first thing we're going to do for apt is that we're going to update the local apt repository. So we're going to run an apt update. You need to use sudo if you're not root already. Type in our sudo password. And this should only take a second or two. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to install the database itself. So sudo apt install. And then we're going to use Mariadb-server as our package name. Mariadb is just an open source fork of MySQL. So when you're talking about databases, you can use Mariadb and MySQL more or less interchangeably. In fact, we'll actually be running MySQL commands later, even though we're targeting Mariadb. We'll also add a -y so that we don't have to type y after it pulls all the packages. It'll just automatically start installing them. Now that the packages are installed, we're going to make sure that the server is set to boot when we boot the system. So as soon as we turn on the system, MySQL or MariaDB will turn on as well. Now it's set to start the MySQL service or the MariaDB service at boot. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to run an included configuration or initialization script. And what this script does is run us through a series of best practice configurations. It'll ask us one by one if we want to take a particular action and how we want to take that action. As we run this, you'll get to see some of the things that we want to configure. SQL databases are extremely dangerous. It's very easy to take advantage of them. And so there's quite a bit that you can do as a systems administrator to help lock those down. This video series is all about SQL injection. So the server configurations won't play as much of a role, but it's important to understand these steps that database admins are or should be taking. For the first step, it's asking us what the root password of the database is. We haven't set one, and by default it's blank, so we're just going to hit enter for none. We're going to say no here. Change the root password. Yes, we do want to change the root password. Now, this is not the Linux root password. This is the root password for the database server itself. So set this to something that's pretty secure. I would not replicate your system's root password. It's going to ask you to type in it again. Do we want to remove anonymous users? The anonymous user, yes. Should only be allowed to connect from localhost. Also, yes. We'll be creating a separate admin user later that will be able to log in remotely. We want to remove the test databases. We don't want anything kind of lingering around, and go ahead and reload the privileges. Excellent. The next set of steps that we're going to take, we're going to create that admin user. So we'll run sudo mariadb, and this is the console that we have. It didn't ask us for authentication because we came in as the root user of the system. And so it just automatically authenticates us to the database itself. So we're going to run some SQL commands here. We're going to say we're going to grant all permissions on every database and table to the admin user. Now we're creating that right now. They're going to be identified by a password. And this password we're going to set right now to foobar with grant option. And then we're going to flush privileges. Now, flushing, basically all this means is that it's saving the configuration that we just made. And we will exit. For the Docker method, this is my preferred way of doing things with Docker. And if you're not using Docker as part of your home testing environment, I'd really recommend checking Docker out because it's been fantastic for my workflow. There's a couple different ways to go about this. One way is to have a Dockerfile. All a Dockerfile is just a way to set settings for a Docker container in a single place that makes it easier to repeat later. When you're using Docker as a test environment, you may have multiple databases that you want to test against throughout an engagement so that you can test different types of potential configurations. And to me, the Dockerfile or even Docker Compose, which you can look into on your own time, makes it much easier to kind of throw up multiple containers. So this is what my Dockerfile looks like. Really, it's just setting up some of the basic environment variables. So we want to set a randomized root password for the database. We want to create a user with the username admin and the password foobar. Alternatively to using the Dockerfile, you can actually include all of this stuff in the Docker run command line, and I'll show you that way as well. But for this method, we're going to do a Docker build. We're just going to call it MySQL. So that's tag it as MySQL. And the dot is we're going to build the image from the configuration files in the current directory. Now that that build command's done, we can Docker run, and we want to set the name of the container to MySQL. This just makes it easier to start and stop the container. We're also going to set the host name to MySQL. We're going to set it to detached mode so it runs in the background. We're going to set the port to expose the port 3306, which is the default port for MySQL. And we're going to say that we're going to run the MySQL image, which we just built a second ago. Now, if we run a Docker container ls, we see that our container is running and it's forwarding that 3306 port. I'll show you both methods, execing into the container to interact with the database, as well as interacting with it from outside of the container. So let's go ahead and Docker exec into MySQL. We're going to run the bin bash command. So we're just going to come in as a shell. And here we can do the MySQL admin command. As I said before, even though it's Mariadb, we're going to be saying MySQL a lot. So you're already starting to see that. We're going to set the user to admin. We're telling it that we want to enter a password, prompt us for the password. This is not saying put your password after this. You don't ever want to enter a password into the prompt, but sometimes you see the P and then you want to put a password after it. That's not what that is. It's saying prompt me for the password. And we're just going to put in a command here. We're going to get the version of Mariadb that's running just to prove that the database is up and we can connect to it. Put in our super secret foobar password, and we can see that the database is running and we can connect to it just fine. Also, we can see that the command utilities that we need to interact with the database are pre-installed in this container. So everything's very self-contained and easy to use. This is why I love using Docker containers for my process. So we'll exit out and we'll try and do the same thing from the host OS. So we'll say MySQL admin, u admin, P, except this time we need to add another argument, which is the -h to say which host we're connecting to. We're going to connect to the host 127001. And when we run this, we see that we don't actually have MySQL admin installed. Since we haven't installed Mariadb, we don't have all the client utilities. So we can fix that pretty easily. So we'll apt install, and the package you want is default MySQL client. And if we run that MySQL admin command again, and add the foobar, and we have the same connectivity that we had within the container. I did mention instead of doing the Dockerfile, we can just run the container from the command line and not have a Dockerfile. Let me just show you that real quick, what that looks like. So we're going to stop the Docker container, and we're going to remove the container that exists right now because we're going to create a new one with the same name, and it'll yell at us if we do that. Now, if we run all of this should look similar so far. What we're going to do next is we're going to add those environment variables that we configured in our Docker container. We can actually just specify them in the command line with the -e for environment. So Mariadb random root password equals yes. We'll set a new environment variable for Mariadb user equals admin. And we'll set another environment variable. This is why I prefer the Dockerfile method instead, is because I really don't like putting credentials and passwords in the command line, because it'll show up in the history and it'll show up in PS and a bunch of other places. So I don't like doing it this way. You can do it this way. I don't like doing it this way. And then the last thing we're going to do is, since we're not targeting the image that we already built locally, we're going to target a different image. In this case, we're going to target the Mariadb latest image. All right. From here, we can container ls, and we see that it's running. We've got the ports exposed. We can run lsof -pi, and we'll see that 33C06 is exposed again. We can docker exec into it. And we have the same experience as before. So instead of managing a Docker file, you could just one-off run this command. And it's exactly the same for us. Thanks so much for staying to the end of this video. If you found it helpful, you may want to check out the rest of the SQL for Hackers series, or any of the CTF walkthrough playlist.